Hi, Jim. Recently, I've been watching a lot of the NWA events from the mid-'80s on WWE Network. One thing I've really come to notice is how much blood and stipulation matches, strap, cage, etc., there is throughout an entire card. My question is if there was ever a backlash or protest against Jason.
The answer simply is no. There was no backlash because that was Southern wrestling, and the reason why people were watching the NWA Jim Crockett Promotions in the mid '80s was because it was the alternative. It was the pro wrestling alternative to this increasingly comedic, bells and whistles, sell the sizzle, not the steak show of the WWF. And so that it was, we've talked about it before, Marvel Comics versus DC Comics. DC was a little more out there, a little more hard to believe, a little more fucking fun, a little less believable. Marvel had the superheroes with problems and, was a little more gritty and earthy. Dusty Rhodes, who was booking at the time, learned from Florida, from Eddie Graham, just as Bill Watts did, just as Kevin Sullivan did, just as a lot of great people did, that you needed to have up and down the card different matches, different stipulations, a package show. There was room for comedy amongst the managers or the valets or whatever, but the guys were totally serious. You didn't break character. And a lot of these personal issues and rivalries culminated in very violent matches. And they were taken seriously as such, especially by the fans anywhere south of Virginia down to Florida and anywhere west all the way to fucking Texas. And in the Midwest, places like Chicago and et cetera, that had grown up on the AWA and more serious wrestling with more serious athletes. So, Vince had the Northeast because that's where he'd always been. And he had the West Coast because they kind of knew wrestling was bullshit. And it was pretty even in the Midwest. Crockett had the South from Texas to Florida to Virginia. And people didn't complain in those days because here's another thing. If the heels did fuck the baby faces, the heat was clearly put on the heels and not the promotion. The promotion took great pains to be seen as baby faces. The referees might be incompetent, but they certainly weren't fucking crooked. And if the people were mad, they were mad at the heels for what they did rather than at the promotion. And very few people, except for the occasional negative Nancy and, blue-haired, snooty old women's group, ever blamed the sport of wrestling for what the heels had perpetrated. And so, no, we didn't get any complaints. We had blood. We had violence. We set people on fucking fire. But we did it in such a way that it was viewed in the context of a realistic sporting event and not just as doing bad taste in the sake of bad taste. And nobody complained. Yeah, go figure.
What are you going to do? It's really unfortunate because, and frankly, that's the thing that people keep asking for now. That's what they're complaining about. They're complaining about the lack of that.
Well, and you see, once again, the people were not smart. You can't get heat now because not only do people know that all this shit's fucking contrived, choreographed, and fucking bullshit, but also because they know that if something is done in bad taste, they blame the promotion. 20, 30 years ago, if something was done that was in bad taste, they blamed the heel that did it, and the heel could be censured or disciplined or fined or whatever, and they weren't mad at the promotion. There's a drastic difference that people today, among the many other things that people today can't understand about wrestling of 20 and 30 years ago and the previous 80 years before that, they can't understand because they don't look at it from the same standpoint that they're not mad at the promotion, they're mad at the heels. Imagine that.
So the behavior was the dastardly deed of one person, not something that was booked that way, because people wouldn't have known.
And in some cases, it would carry over. When Waldo Von Erich in Buffalo, a famous example, I believe it was Buffalo, said, well, what's the difference between an apple pie and a Jew's? The apple pie doesn't scream when you put it in the oven. Well, they canceled the fucking television. And they canceled the TV in Calgary when fucking Iron Mike DiBiase, went there and nobody was accustomed to having the citizenry or the local town, insulted. And I heard Mike DiBiase said, well, if brains were dynamite, the people in Calgary couldn't blow their nose, and they canceled the TV. Or in San Francisco, the reason why they drew such incredible money in the late 50s when Jim Barnett set Roy Shire up with studio wrestling on the local channel 11, and Ray Stevens was the top star, and he came out and started doing promos knocking the people of San Francisco. He didn't go too far, but he went far enough because the people there were used to, nothing but praise for their wonderful, beautiful city. And all of a sudden he's going, these people, the women are ugly and the men don't know what they're doing. And that drew money because it caused heat. But now, since everybody knows exactly what's going on, if something is done in bad taste, the heels are not blamed and the promotion can't do damage control. The promotion is blamed because everybody knows they're the ones telling them to say it. So that's another way we fucked ourselves out of a goddamn prosperous, profitable business by letting everybody know.
In some cases, from what I can tell, sometimes it was the faces saying some pretty horrendous stuff. Just a couple days ago, I did a show with Bob Evans, and he told me to go watch a promo from Jerry Lawler on Jimmy Valiant. And I guess it's a pretty famous one. And he says, just be prepared.
Give that video out to the wrestlers in OVW and in training class to say, this is how you have a fucking argument. Because it was beautiful. It was beautiful. Because it was
yeah.
The one where he looks at Valiant, and it could, because Wayne Ferris, the honky tonk man. Wayne Ferris is Jerry Lawler's cousin, right?
Yeah.
And Wayne Ferris had become the apprentice and the sidekick of handsome Jimmy Valiant, who was Jerry Lawler's rival. And Lawler's standing there, and he's looking at Valiant, he's looking at Ferris, he's going, you got Wayne Ferris, you got my cousin there with a fucking earring in his ear and a little tattoo, and his fucking fingernail is painted silver. He looks like a fag just like you are. Because there's Valiant with bleach blonde hair, and they said about faggot about 5 times, and they're fucking cussing at each other on live Memphis television. But it was believable. It was what Jerry Lawler would have said if his cousin had been swayed by this fucking guy that he'd been going back and forth with for a year and a half. And it was what Jimmy Valiant would have said if Lawler was talking about the guy that he'd taken under his wing, and Wayne Ferris is standing there going, I'm just glad to be in this main event spot. And you believe that these two motherfuckers, Jerry Lawler and Jimmy Valiant, hated each other and were going to beat the fuck out of each other when they got in the ring on Monday night.
Oh, and absolutely.
That was the whole thing, is the fans would accept some outrageous statements from both guys because they didn't think, and they were right. The promoter wasn't telling them to say this. The promoter was saying, go out there and have an argument. And they were left up to themselves as what to say, and they said things that made people believe that they hated each other and they were having a real argument, and it sold tickets rather than getting people to call up and say, oh, goddamn, you got to cancel this fucking program because this is just outrageous.
It was really interesting to watch with my sort of modern sensibilities because, number one, seeing Bill Dundee standing there looking like a tiny Elvis, which was very interesting to me. He just looked like an adorable tiny miniature Elvis.
On Lawler's side with his mouth shut, like Ferris was on Valiant's side with his mouth shut.
And seeing Jimmy Valiant as I met him as this sweet, gentle old hippie, or at least that's how I interpret him. It's just, and it's funny. The other thing is I noticed how thick Lawler's accent was, which it isn't now. I don't know if that's something he worked on consciously or, was told not to be so Southern on television. But when he does commentary on Raw, he doesn't sound like that anymore. No, he was. But see, here's the thing. Not only has he been told, no, don't sound Southern, because obviously they split me and JR up as a commentary team because we sounded too Southern. We just did our jobs too well. But also, the more Southern that Lawler sounded as a babyface in Memphis, Tennessee, the more that the people identified with him. So he didn't, he was born in Cleveland. Oh, so he was cranking it up. So he was cranking it up is what you're saying. He was
cranking it up just like Bill Clinton cranks it up when he does a Southern fundraiser down in the South. And just like any politician cranks it up when they're in that genre. He was cranking it up because the more Southern he sounded, the more that the people that he was that were watching him, that were going to buy a ticket that Monday night, would identify with him. Whereas Jimmy Valiant, who also was born in the sticks in Tennessee, but who made his name by being the boy from New York City, was not going to, as a heel, sound like a Southern boy.
Because then he'd sound like one of us, right?
Yeah. With him. He didn't want people to fucking identify with him at that point. He wanted people to think that he was from New York City and, whoo, Missy Daddy, I'm going to beat the king of Memphis on Monday night and I'm going to get the street people, blah, blah, blah. It was all up to them as to what they did to get over or get people pissed off, whether they were a heel or babyface. That was the magic of wrestling. And every once in a while, Jerry Jarrett or Eddie Marlin would come out on Memphis TV and say, we apologize for the comments that were made. We can't believe this motherfucker had just said what he said what he said. And when Eddie Gilbert ran Jerry Lawler over in the parking lot, this is the most famous example of real life cutting into an angle on Memphis television, which, by the way, I wrote a column about in Fighting Spirit magazine here recently, and you can go to jimcornette.com and find out information. I have the Fighting Spirit magazine archives up, and also you can find out how to read this fine publication. But one of the most famous examples of real life intruding in a wrestling angle was Jerry Lawler came out one day, I believe it was the late 80s, and ran Eddie Gilbert, who was bad-mouthing him, and his brother Doug out of the studio and out into the parking lot. And as Lawler went out looking for him, Eddie and Doug had jumped in their car and started it up and revved it up. And as Lawler's looking around and Eddie Marlin, the promoter, is trying to get him back in the studio, they floored the fucking thing. And there's Lawler standing in the way, and they ran Lawler over with their car. And this was the goddamnedest thing, and I encourage anybody to look it up on YouTube. Lawler used to take this bump because Lawler's a goddamn stuntman at heart in high school, right? He thought he could do it again. Well, he was 40 years old at that point, so bear in mind a 40-year-old man, and he's wearing black sweatshirt and black sweatpants because he's got elbow pads and knee pads on underneath in the middle of the summer. Eddie Gilbert ran over him with a fucking car. Lawler went up over the hood. Not only that, but the windshield hit him, and he went up over the top of the car and took way more extravagant of a bump than he intended to. And I remember Eddie talking to me about it. He said, Doug looked at him and said, I think you've killed him. And they drove off out of the parking lot, and Lawler was left laying there. And so many people watching the live show on Channel 5 called the police and said Eddie Gilbert has just murdered Jerry Lawler in the parking lot of Channel 5, that the police showed up at Channel 5 and said if Jerry Lawler doesn't go out by the end of the program and fucking show everybody he's still alive, we're going to take all of you to jail. Oh, God. And so Lawler had to go, and then the smart fans, what there were of them at the time, were hot. Well, why did they do this great angle? And then Lawler comes out and fucking says, I'm going to get you Monday night, Eddie, because the cops told him they were going to take him all to fucking jail unless he did. That's
the cops always ruin a good time.
Yeah. The cops are always getting in the way. But that's the flavor of wrestling then versus wrestling now. And
it just seems so renegade and so wild and sort of fly by the seat of your pants fun. It seems fun.
There you go. You just renegade, wild, fly by the seat of your pants. That's why it was so much fucking fun.